Welcome back to the workshop. My name's Jack, this is Everyman Builds, and this is assembling an Ooznest Workbee Z1 Plus CNC router. I did say at the end of the last episode, this episode would be the X-Gantry. It's actually not, it's the X-Carriage. The fourth episode is going to be the X-Gantry. This episode is going to be broken down into multiple parts. We've got the Z plate, then we've got the X-axis wheels, and finally the Z-axis and extrusion, which I'll have a slight detour in because I've got the XYZ touch probe, requires slightly different spacers. So let's get into it. So first thing is we've got the Z plate. Now the back of this is the part with the inset, and the right hand side is the more open holes. You see this side they are uniform. This side there are three slightly larger. This is my right hand side. Obviously for you it will be that way. And that's your right hand side, that's your left hand side. As before, I'm going to assemble this all in one go. I'm not going to do wheel by wheel. I'm going to do all of the wheels at the same time because I think that's easier. You may not find it that way, but it is. For this you will need 6 30mm button head bolts, M5 bolts. You will need 3 eccentric 6mm spacers, 3 aluminium 6mm spacers, 6 wheels, 12 precision shims, 6 nylock nuts, and the Z-axis nut block. So first I'm going to just pop the 30mm bolts through there. So we've got that, then we have the eccentric nuts. We put the eccentric part facing into the plate, all on one side, and on the left side you put your aluminium spacers. Then we have 1 precision shim on each of the 6 bolts, 1 wheel on each of the 6 bolts. So I can see here that this one actually, the shim on the inside is ever so slightly out of center, which means I can probably seat that home a bit more. And then a precision shim again. Whoops, dropped one. It was bound to happen eventually. So precision shim on each of the bolts. And then finally a nylock nut. And these need to be completely tightened down at this point. So we're going to put them just hand tight for now, and then once they're all on, I will tighten them down all in one go, one at a time, but all at once. So my pro tip for this episode is probably to use a ratcheting tool rather than an Allen key, because that was a lot easier. And not only that, I've got a lot more bits for drivers than I have Allen keys. So we're going to adjust this now so that we've got the 6mm part showing here, because this is effectively the bottom, or it's the outside, shall we say, the opposite side to the static spacers, like that. We then have to get the extrusion and make sure that's okay. So we put the extrusion in, rest it on the static side, so there's lots of wobble, and then adjust. So the 6mm faces the bottom. So that should move a little bit of force, come out entirely, but go back in and hold its position if we don't move it. So that's on. We have adjusted the wheel alignment. Now we need to put the nut block, which is this, onto this plate. And it does say that in here we've got the small threaded bolt goes into this end, and that stops the backlash. So we'll thread that in, and that's supposed to just touch the surface on the opposite side. So you can see here, I put my finger behind it, maybe. No, let's put a bit of paper behind it. That'll be a bit clearer. So you can just see there, if I wind it back, there's a tiny gap. I just want it to touch the opposite surface just barely. And then with the 2 recesses for the bolts facing outwards, and the eccentric screws on the right hand side again. So make sure they are that way. We put that on there. There's one nut in the packet that it says to discard, so we will do that. And now we need, what do we need? Two 25mm bolts and two nylon nuts. I didn't have these ready, did I? What I've done between episodes is to take all of the hardware out of the box and put them here. So I've got M3, M4, M5 nuts, M5T nuts, M2.5, 3, 4 bolts, M5 bolts, and longer M5 bolts, because going through the box every time was a bit of a pain. This makes it just a tiny bit easier. So this needs to go into the middle. And there is a recess for the bolts to go into. That's a bit tight. So what we're going to do is just screw that through there. Just enough so that we can get the nuts on the other side. So drop the nuts into place and screw all the way through into them. So that is step one done, or step one of this step. We've got 3 eccentric spacers, 3 normal spacers. It should still glide nicely on here. Ouch! And the Z nut block goes nicely inside the channel. So we're going to put that one side and discard bag at the nut, and then we're going to get all of the pieces for the next step, which is the X-axis mount. So I've got all of my pieces now ready for the next step, which is the X-axis mount. It's similar to previous nut block assemblies in that there are 2 slots on each side of the mount, and that's so that the nut block can move side to side until we've got a nice snug fit against the lead screw. Each one of these is assembled with 2 25mm M5 bolts, and they go through the back into the nut block, and then there is an M5 nylock nut to secure it in place. So just going to hand tighten the nylock nuts and then secure them. It's worth pointing out that this particular assembly is symmetrical, so it doesn't matter if it's one way or the other. The only difference is one side says Workbee, one side says Ooznest. I'm going to have the side that says Ooznest facing the other components, so that it should be facing me, I think, once it's all fully assembled. So that's step one done. We can still move these, and that's what we need. The next step is to get the limit switch on the Z plate. So the Z plate has 2 tiny little holes at the bottom that are threaded, and the limit switch goes on there. Again, this plate is not symmetrical, and what you need to do is have the limit switch on the 2 threaded holes that are offset and towards the bottom right. As you mount it on the bottom right, the limit switch should point downwards to the bottom right as well, so that it triggers at the bottom right. It's not very clear from the pictures, and in reading some of the comments it tripped other people up as well. And it also needs to be on, it says, the back of the plate. The front has the recesses in for the bolt heads, the back does not. And then there is a tiny Allen key or hex key required to put these in, and they're quite very finely threaded, so it might take a little bit of time to get them all the way in. It's important as well to get the right limit switch. It does say in the instructions to check the cheat sheet, and the cheat sheet for this particular model says that the correct one is labelled 2. You shouldn't need to over tighten these, and it says to not worry about the cable at the moment because we will deal with that later. And now we're going to do the wheels on this portion and here. So using the bit that we've got, the plate that we've got with the Z-axis limit switch, we're going to put some wheels on here. It's a very, very similar assembly to before, and I've got all of my pieces here. It is a 60mm bolt, which then has eccentric bolts at the bottom, followed by a shim, wheel, spacer, wheel, shim, nut, other plate, shim, nylock nut. So we go through from this side, and I'm going to do this in a very similar way to that I've done the other wheel assemblies now, and that is I'm going to put all of the pieces on at the same time because I find it easier. I find it to be more efficient. You may not agree, and that's your prerogative. The eccentric nuts go at the bottom, which is where the limit switch is. This side is the bottom. And as before, we will orientate them that the 6mm bit faces downwards. The circular side of it goes through the hole in the plate. We've got aluminium spacers at the top. Then we have shim. Oops, dropped one again. Shim on all 4 pieces. Wheel. And that one's not lined up very well either, so we'll just adjust that. Then a shim again. Nope, that's not right. I was right the first time. A 9mm spacer. Then another wheel. Then the shim. Then either the eccentric spacer if it's the bottom ones, or the aluminium spacer for the top ones. Then we flip this over, assemble the 2 parts together. Make sure that the eccentric spacers are inside the holes. 1 precision shim on each piece. And then finally a nylock nut. These can be tightened down fully because this is the wheel assembly, and you'll be pleased to know the last wheel assembly that you need to do. So I'm just going to tighten these down here. All of the wheels should still move freely, which they do. And now comes the potentially tricky part of aligning the wheels correctly using the extrusion. Because once we've got that all done, the next step is obviously to make sure the wheel alignment is correct so that it moves freely. But we've got this cable as well that we need to be wary of and make sure that we don't damage. Let's just get the 6mm part facing downwards, so that the wheels are at their furthest apart, like so. Insert the extrusion. Once again, be careful that you don't catch the wires here, because they are right there. We don't want to damage them. We're going to turn each of these 4 faces in one direction. That should be nice and tight on each of those. Oops. Do the same on this side. So each of the wheels moves the extrusion. There. Oops. Ouch. Be careful of that. Nothing catches, and I should be able to, as before, take the extrusion out and place it back in without too much of an issue. And then we'll know it's not too tight, which we can do on that side. I'm not going to push it all the way through because I don't want to catch the wires, but we can do it on that side as well. So that's that portion done. Next, I need to get some more pieces for this assembly. So this is now connecting this way onto this portion. And for that we need 4 12mm bolts, 4 shims and 4 locking washers. Make sure that the eccentric spacers are on the right hand side. Place that on there. Locking nut underneath. Precision shim. 1 bolt. And it's threaded on the other side, so there's no need for any nuts here. I'm going to tighten that down. Don't over tighten, because if you over tighten, the locking washer will actually not work as effectively as it could. You need to give it a little bit of tightness, a little bit of compression, but not too much. So that's that assembly done. The Z-axis extrusion is actually the bit that we've been using the whole time to check the tightness of the wheels. It's the extrusion D. You can see that there. I just need to get some more pieces. We need the Z end plate, 4 5mm button head 16mm bolts, and that's it. So we're going to get 5mm 5 M5 16mm button head bolts. We're going to get 4 of those. 1, 2, 3, 4. Put that back in the pile. Find the Z plate, Z end stop. That's the Y plate. The Z end plate has 2. There are 2 of them. I can see that in the picture now. So we actually need, that's the Z end plate, and they are symmetrical as well. Need 8 16mm M5 button head bolts. It says to tighten one of them and then loosen it 1 full turn. Slide onto here, attach the bottom one, tighten it, and loosen it 1 full turn. And the reason for that will become clear later. Why we can't know now, I don't know. It's a big secret. But we're going to use, it wants to use those 4. So I'm going to just put these in by hand and then show you which 4 holes it would like you to use. So your end plate with the C channel there will look like that. So we're going to tighten those down, switch the ratcheting action, and 1 full turn. 1 full turn. 1 full turn. I can't imagine it needs to be very specifically 1 full turn, because that would be crazy, but we're going to follow it as much as we can. Now I'm going to put the extrusion over this assembly. Hide it all the way to the end, and then put this end plate on. I do beg your pardon, the top one should be tightened fully. So this one here should be tightened fully. The one at the bottom should not be tightened fully. So I will go back and tighten the top one after I have loosened the bottom one. Tighten, loosen by 1 full turn. Loosen by 1 full turn. Loosen by 1 full turn. And loosen by 1 full turn. Change the action on my ratchet. Tighten fully. Tighten fully. Tighten fully. And tighten fully. Job done. Now we need to attach the stepper motor, and this part is slightly different from me because I've got the XYZ touch probe. Where the normal assembly uses a 40mm spacer, if you have the XYZ touch probe, you use the 35mm spacer and part of the probe. And I'll show you that step now. With the touch probe you get this assembly, and in there is a 5mm lip. This pokes out from the, let me just sort this out. I'm very wary that I'm going to damage this cable, so I'm just going to tuck it up in here to stop it from sliding around and flipping around everywhere. So with the X plate at the back, we put the stepper motor on the top, and we need to use something that they should be recessed. Is it recessed on the other side that I've missed? I hope not. It is. I think the words we use here are calamitous fool. Somehow I missed that the end plate has recesses in it for the bolt heads to sit inside, which makes sense because every other plate had that feature. So we'll stick with the calamitous fool statement. At least we caught it early. I'd say thanks for your help, but you didn't do anything. Which means I probably also need to undo the bottom plate as well, don't I? Ordinarily I would use an impact driver or a very, very low torque drill driver to assemble things. But one of the very first instructions in the assembly manual for this machine is don't use drill drivers or impact drivers, you do it all by hand because you don't want to cross-thread something, you don't want to damage something. And while I appreciate the sentiment, it doesn't do anything for my hands. All yours. So with this facing this way, we want to have the block for the touch probe on the left hand side. So with the X plate facing away from me, the touch probe goes on the left hand side here. We get move that out of the way. We have two 35mm aluminium spacers that we're going to use here, and this is with 50mm bolts. And we also need to get the 50mm bolts. These are cap head bolts again, 4, and I also need two 40mm spacers from the brackets and spacers box. We're going to find those. I haven't laid all of these pieces out simply because I haven't needed to use them an awful lot yet. If it gets to a point that I'm constantly dipping into this box, then I will lay out all of the bags as I have over there for the hardware. Now we need to find a Z-axis stepper motor, and that's going to be in the stepper motors box. I believe that these are all NEMA 23, so it doesn't matter which one I use here. They're all quite big, bulky units. But we're going to have this plate on the left. We're going to have, let's do it this way. I'm going to put the 4 bolts through the stepper motor. Then we're going to orient the wire so that the wire faces towards the back of the X-Carriage. So it should be that way, with the wire facing away from me and towards the back of the X-Carriage there. So on the right hand side, I'm going to put the 40mm spacers. There. What I might do is just tighten those a tiny bit, just a turn or two, just so they don't come out. And then that will let me raise those up without dropping anything. Put the 35mm spacers into the touch probe bracket, slide that into place there, and then push the bolts through. There may have been a much more graceful way of doing that, but it worked. That's all that really matters. What I should have done is re-recorded this whole section, because what I should have done is followed the instructions a tiny bit more closely, because there is a coupler we need to put on here before we assemble this. And it's going to get to a point where I'm doing and undoing things, and I would imagine a lot of people will end up in a similar situation. You just kind of become, at least I do, become blind to instructions at some point. And you just want to get on and do things, and the instructions seem to get in the way all the time. So we're going to take that back off very carefully, flip it upside down, lose everything. Doesn't matter if you did it carefully or not. So each coupler comes packaged in its own package inside the package. The smaller side fixes onto the stepper motor with the grub screw facing the shaft there. Now we're going to do this part again. So this goes here. Get one bolt there. Hold that all with 7 hands. Tighten that down just a touch. That should hold. Move this. That's that done at last. Okay, so let's lay this on its back. Like so. I'm going to find the Z-axis lead screw. These are labelled. We can just pop that off. So we need to find the lead screw. We want 2 lock collars. The small set screw has come out of both of them. I don't know if that's part of them coming. We need 2 flanged radial bearings. They are going to sit presumably inside the end plates with the flange stopping them from coming out. 2 of those. Put that back in there. And we need 2 bearing shims, which are here. If you haven't got, and this is probably a bit too late to say this, but if you haven't got a set of Allen keys in pretty much every size, you might want to get them before you start this project. So we are going to make that accessible to me. So I'm going to lay it this way. You won't be able to see what's going on, unfortunately. But it's all going to happen inside there anyway. So we slide that through. Move that out of the way. That through all we can see. Let's tip it on its back and we can show the world. So can we see? Yep. So we slide it through. We put a flanged radial bearing facing downwards. So the flange is at the top. We put a bearing shim. If we can pick it up, I'm going to move the rest of these lead screws out of the way again. Bearing shim and a loose lock collar. Let's just open that so that we can put it onto the screw, like that. And then we go up to the nut block and thread it through. That comes down. Once we've threaded through, and we have enough space, we can then put lock collar, shim, and flanged bearing the opposite way to what we just did. So that, the collar, the shim, and the flanged bearing. So we'll thread this all the way through. I see why it's called a flexible coupler now, because it's flexible. Right, so that's going to about there. So I want to place the middle about there. So I need to move it a small portion. Is that loosening that, or is that just spinning on the top? That's just spinning on the top. So we want to thread the lead screw until it is touching, and then we position half and half, tighten down the clamping bolts, then tighten down the set screws or grub screws. I use terms interchangeably for those. At the top and bottom, slide the flanged radial bearing along the Z-screw until they're fully seated. Slide the bearing shim, slide the lock collar firmly against it, and then secure in place. So we're now going to tip this upside down. So we can see in there, we've got the flanged radial bearing, the bearing shim, and the lock collar. I'm going to press the flanged bearing into the hole, then the shim, then the collar, and then I'm going to hold it in place and tighten the collar. Then slide. Now, I can't slide that up anymore, can I? Because now it's threaded on there. But what we can do, twist a coupler to twist the lead screw. Slide that into place on the bottom one. Make sure that's fully seated. Hold that in place, tighten the locking collar. And with that, we now tighten bottom with this, which tightens against the whole thing and pulls everything together. And that's that assembly done. No, it's not. The Z-axis backlash, which was in there, how are we going to get access to that? If I mean, that's a long way down. Let's see if we can get to that. Hold the assembly firmly and check any up and down play in the extrusion D. No, I mean there's no play in this at all. So I'm going to say that I don't need to do anything here. And then finally, we're going to put a drag chain mount on here. So I'm going to find that, which I believe is right here. Oops. The final drag chain mount. So limit switch 2 is here. That's the opposite hole. So I do need to unbind the cable at this point. And this goes through here, like that. It's a bit spaghetti because it's just been built. I'm going to unspaghetti it first. So this cable goes through here. Now because it's not spaghetti, it goes through very nicely. We do need to pull it tight at some point. So we do that, we get two button head 16mm bolts to attach the drag chain to here. On the back of the drag chain there is a slot that goes through there. So once we've assembled this onto here, the wire gets fed through there and up through there. So like that, I guess. What I will do, and I have done for the previous episodes, is list everything you need on the screen and in the description so that you can get yourself ready without having to read through the instructions to itemize everything. Everything will be itemized for you. Aren't I nice? Through here. And these go into the two holes there. So from the plate there's a hole there. I don't know if we can see that. Let's try and get some light on it. There are two holes anyway. There, we use the bottom one and the bottom one. So we're going to put the bolt through, and you may note from the previous time we did something with the drag chain, that the drag chain has slots as opposed to just straight holes, and that is so that we can adjust them if we need to. Now I have pulled the limit switch wires quite taut here, and I did that because once the extrusion goes through the side, it's going to push against it, whereas if it's quite taut, it pulls them forward a bit. So I'm going to keep them quite taut, and I'm going to tighten this down. Worst case, I come back later and undo it and make it a little bit looser, but I think taut is going to be better. It doesn't actually say whether it should be taut or whether it should be loose. It would be handy if it did. What I will do as well is put some pros and cons, I think, of the manual. I've made a few notes as I'm going along. This is one of them. How tight does this cable need to be? Do I need to pull it all the way through? Do I need to leave some slack? And there are some other points that could have been better explained, like the position of the limit switch and the way that the switch is actually oriented. It's not clear from the pictures, it's not clear from the descriptions, and it would help just a tiny bit of extra time on the manual. And the manual is very good, don't get me wrong. A tiny bit of extra effort on the manual would have made it so much clearer when assembling. So that has play that side but not that side. Let's undo that a touch more. There we go. Now it has some wobble. Right. Limit switch wire. Okay, next page. Pull the limit switch wire taut all the way through the drag chain mount, and then use a small cable tie to secure it. So, we want to pull the cable taut through here. Taut, it's tight. Want to put it taut all the way up, all the way through the drag chain mount. Bend it there. So we have that with a cable tie through, and then lock it into place with a cable tie. And I'm going to get some side cutters instead of using a knife. Right. Drag chain mount, limit switch wire. Everything is in place. This portion of the build is done. Finally, that took a long time. That took probably a good 2 hours in itself, if not longer. I'll have a look back at the footage. What I'll do as well is put roughly how long each portion takes. Obviously with filming it takes ever so slightly longer than it would if you were just running with the instructions. If you've read through the instructions, if you've got everything prepared, filming takes ever so slightly longer, but that was a lot of assembly for that one piece. I mean, it's a fairly substantial piece, sure, but we'll see how the rest of this goes. Now that doesn't move anymore because it's got that with the limit switch. That does trigger. I'm just looking. It does trigger, and it triggers very, very, very solidly. So that's the end of this episode. Please do join me for the next episode where we will be doing the X-Gantry, and we will be doing the X-Gantry this time. If you haven't watched the previous episodes and you've come to this first, it's probably too late in the video for me to tell you to go back and watch them. But hopefully I'll see you in the next video. Take care.